Okay, everyone, welcome back. Hello. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Thanks so much for coming back from the break so quickly and yeah. I want to introduce you all to Kentaro Toyama. He is working as a researcher at University of Berkeley. He's got a lot of interest in what we've been discussing, maybe I should talk, in discussing in the last session, the last 2 hours in terms of digital poverty, ICT systems, what does it mean in terms of these new multi-dimensions of poverty and the digital divide. So as mentioned, we read Kentaro's Boston Review paper, and we had a bit of a Twitter bonanza for the last 15 minutes. And so Kentaro, thanks so much for joining us at your wee hours of the morning, 7 a.m. in the west coast of the States. We've got about, how many students here today? 25 students here today. And it would be great if you can chat about yourself, about why you wrote that article, your interest in the article. And the students also would love to express some of their opinions, what they've been discussing the last half hour or so about the article. So if I could pass it on to you, Kentaro.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So I usually hand that article out as an introduction to what I currently believe about ICT and development. And it's probably a pretty good representation of my current beliefs. I used to run a research lab in India for 5 years where we, a group of us, about 10 researchers, a mix of social scientists and technologists, did nothing but ICT for D research. We would go to very rural areas in India, but also in several other countries outside of India, as well as urban slums. And we would try to both understand how they currently interact with technology, what their existing challenges were, and then try to find different ways to use electronic technologies to support whatever it was that they needed or wanted. And the technologies that we use range from everything from PCs to radio, to mobile phones, to even hardware that we designed and produced ourselves. And ultimately, after 5 years of doing this, I would say I probably oversaw maybe 50-odd research projects where the goal was to intervene in some form and help poorer populations with technology. And the conclusion I came to at the end of all of this was that while technology has some potential to help in a certain kind of situation, that more often than not, it was either the people who were running the project, our partners, or the people who were ultimately using the technology that made much more of a difference in terms of even whether the technology had a positive impact. And so in 2009, I actually quit Microsoft simply because I was no longer interested in trying to find ways for technology to have an impact, and I started thinking about what exactly it was that I had learned, and one of the outcomes is the article that you read. So as you probably saw and have been discussing, my main thesis is that technology is an amplifier of human intent and capacity, and by that what I mean is that it is magnifying whatever human capacity is already there. So if the capacity is positive and the intention is positive, then the technology will help make things better. If the intention is negative, which is unfortunately often the case, especially when you're dealing with corruption, then oftentimes technology will only make things worse. And then there are plenty of cases, particularly when you talk about development, where the capacity, especially with respect to information and knowledge and all of the things that are passing through as bits in information technology, is very small. And so no amount of technology is really sufficient to change the underlying situation. So I'll give you one example of that thesis. In 2005, we ran a project in probably the world's first project where we intentionally replaced an existing PC network that spanned a bunch of villages that did sugarcane farming with mobile phones. So this was in 2005. It was 2 years before M-Pesa. Around that time, Africa had mobile penetration of probably around 10%, 10 to 12%, I think. Mobile phones were still not widely discussed in international development. But PCs were very popular. So people thought that if you took a internet-connected PC to a rural village and ran services off of it like telemedicine or distance education or agriculture information, that you could actually go as far as to double rural incomes just through a internet telecenter. So what we found in one particular situation was that the computers were very expensive to maintain. People would leave them in rooms that were otherwise used for fertilizer storage. Rats would chew through the cords. They really like the rubber that is around, that wraps around a lot of electrical cords. And the maintenance costs were too high for them to keep up this particular network, even though they were getting some value out of it by allowing the sugarcane processing center to communicate with farmers in the villages. We found that the communication that they were doing was actually very limited, and so we replaced the entire PC system in 7 villages with mobile phones, and we allowed them to basically text information back and forth, usually prompted by the farmer who was querying for how much of his sugarcane was actually being harvested and sold. We found that we did a study on the 7 villages, and we found that the farmers liked it better. The system worked better than the previous system in that it was able to get information out to the farmers much more quickly. Basically, the turnaround time was just a few minutes. The time it takes to send and receive an SMS, whereas the previous computer system required human beings at either end. It was ultimately cheaper. We could run the mobile phone system for something like $25,000 US less than the PC system over 1 year if they were to do it for the entire set of villages that they worked in, which is about 50 villages. So everything sounded great. After the project, we tried to convince the cooperative to spread the system to other villages because farmers in the other villages had heard about it and they wanted it. But there was some political issue within the cooperative. We were working with the man who had founded this particular cooperative, as well as with the IT person at the cooperative, but there was a man who was the managing director there who felt somehow that he was not a part of the system, and so he didn't feel a strong, in fact, he felt a need to resist. And we worked very hard to kind of, assuage issues there. We went back several times to keep talking to the group as a whole, but somehow we weren't able to get over this political issue. And so what happened was that the pilot stayed in the 7 villages and never got out beyond the 7 villages that we piloted in. So this is a very typical situation where technology is great. It does exactly what you want it to do, but there are social challenges that you need to overcome in order to actually have the impact that you want. This is certainly not limited to the developing world. There are plenty of places in the developed world, and by that I include the rich portions of the developing countries as well, where ultimately it's human intention that is blocking the right use of technology. So the example that I give in the article that you read is that if you think about it, the United States is often considered the most prolific producer. Widespread. Almost everybody has a mobile phone, if not a landline. And you would expect in a country with that much technology that things would be better after the technology than before the technology. But the reality is that since the 1970s, the poverty rate in the United States itself has really not budged for basically 40 years, despite the fact that those 40 years were the same 40 years that we've all seen great advances in computer technology and mobile phone technology in all kinds of ICTs. Many people think that the last 30, 40 years have been a golden age for innovation in electronic technologies, but none of that has really touched or changed the underlying situation of poverty in the United States. And I attribute that not to the fact that the technology is worthless, just that it is impacting things in exactly the way that the underlying social tendencies tend to exist. So in the United States, the country has really not been focused on reducing poverty for the last 40 years. And that is a social issue, it's a cultural issue, it's a political issue, and none of that has been changed fundamentally by the technology, although technology has certainly changed a lot of different things. So that's my overall stance on technology and development, and I would be very interested in hearing what you have been discussing.
Hey, Kentaro, thanks so much for that story. I mean, political stoppages. I mean, it's just one aspect of, a non-digital barrier that is part of that socioeconomic constraints to move certain types of projects to get to a point where lives are changing and that well-being and livelihoods improve. So no, thanks so much for that case study, as well as the perspective coming from the U.S. That's interesting that the poverty levels haven't changed in the U.S. since the 70s. That's quite striking. So what does that leave for us here in South Africa? And whether technology will make change or create change, when we're talking about the poor and trying to change the levels of poverty here in South Africa. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite some students. I don't know if everyone had a representative from their group to come and chat to you. Does everyone want to come up just a second? So who's going to come up for examples of can technology and poverty, the examples and evidence for? Okay. And if you could just introduce yourself as well.